Natalya has taught at Nipissing University since 2005 and specializes in immigration to small urban centers and rural communities. Natalya will launch the conversation with her presentation on innovative retention strategies for newcomers to small centers and rural communities. And I will now welcome Natalya to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. As Jessica said, I'm Natalya Brown, an associate professor at Nipissing University, and I'm also the vice chair of the Standing Committee for Northern, Rural, and Remote Communities at Pathways to Prosperity. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see. Are we all good? Okay. All right, so I want to thank you for this opportunity to share insights on innovative retention strategies for small centers and rural communities. I'm coming to you today from North Bay, which is on a territory that's in the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and it's also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Nipissing First Nation. So Canada is a major receiving country that relies increasingly on immigration to meet shortages of skilled labor. These persistent labor shortages have implications for productivity, business, and community sustainability. So it's important to consider how we can make newcomers feel more welcome and allow them to thrive in our businesses and in our communities. So my plan is to first briefly discuss the factors that impact retention of newcomers to small urban centers and communities, and then discuss how COVID-19 has changed things for smaller communities and the workplace. Then I'll discuss examples of innovative strategies that address key areas of retention. First, finding the right fit, language and education, housing, and community support and engagement. Finally, I'll end a discussion on how businesses and communities can derive benefits from diversity that newcomers bring with them. Now, employers in small centers and rural communities in Canada often struggle to attract and retain newcomers. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about. Although compensation is important, for many immigrant professionals in small communities, there are many other aspects of the workplace that impact the decision to stay or leave. Newcomers are more likely to stay with an organization that provides them with work that is fulfilling, where there are clear roles, where they receive recognition, where they're given the flexibility to try to achieve organizational goals in their own way, and where differences are not merely tolerated, but valued or seen as an asset. And sometimes the personal attributes of newcomers themselves, such as language skills and their understanding of workplace culture, can help or hinder integration and performance. Now, having stable and fulfilling employment is only one part of the picture when it comes to retention. There are a variety of community factors that account for low retention rates, including limited employment opportunities for family members, the distance from family and social connections, limited access to settlement services and other mainstream services, the lack of large immigrant populations and access to cultural and religious supports, inadequate housing and public transportation, limited availability of affordable childcare and educational opportunities, and experiences of racism and intolerance. While employment and the presence of family and social connections are primary retention factors for immigrants to small centers and rural communities, other factors such as creating a sense of community, the lower cost of living, educational opportunities provided by nearby post-secondary institutions, or the immigrants' affinity for rural and small center lifestyles are also important. So when we talk about COVID-19 effects, even as we open up and public health restrictions are lifted, COVID-19 will have a lasting impact on the workplace and the nature of employment. We should consider what these changes might mean for newcomers as they integrate into the Canadian workplace. We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted immigrant communities because of their greater participation in jobs that are deemed essential with limited options for working remotely. We've seen heightened levels of psychological distress resulting from personal financial pressures, social isolation, fear of infection, threat of job loss, and uncertainty in the work environment, such as varying working hours, sudden closures, and evolving public health restrictions. When it comes to newcomers, language barriers, differences in work style, and limited social capital are some of the factors that put them at a disadvantage. COVID-19 has brought labor shortages to the forefront, and we have observed changes in migration flows as a result of the pandemic. What we're seeing is immigrants and migrants from urban areas moving to smaller centers and rural communities in greater numbers than before. So there's an opportunity there. So in terms of our innovative retention strategies, these attempt to address some of the key challenges faced by newcomers as they integrate into a new workplace and a new community. First, determining whether the business or the community is the right fit for the newcomer and their families early on in the process will improve the chance of retention. The successful integration of newcomers involves the entire community, including previous immigrants and refugees, working with townships, municipalities, and community organizations to create welcoming communities. Many strategies are often led by employers. Employers can do a lot to create workplaces that promote social integration in the work and connect newcomers with other workers. Communities that are successful in retaining newcomers have been able to expand the capacity of their Main Street services and provide programs that are specific for immigrants to meet their needs. Programs that help their families thrive in the community can provide an anchor for immigrant professionals. Now, there are conditions that are necessary for organizations to benefit from the diversity that newcomers bring to their workforce. Now, these conditions, when diversity is introduced, they will determine whether or not the impact is positive and long-lasting, and those circumstances that are conducive to harnessing the benefits of diversity are inclusive and socially just. So the strategies that I'm going to talk about now are not exhaustive. I'm going to use a few illustrative examples to highlight the themes here. So there are many ways that communities themselves can assist newcomers to determine whether or not the community is the right fit for them, such as establishing accurate perceptions of the community through promotional campaigns, exploratory visits, and immigration web portals. It is important to bridge as many informational gaps for newcomers before they arrive in the community. That will help them to determine if it's the right fit, and they're more likely to stay. Now, the International and Community Matchmaker is a project of the Northern Policy Institute that focuses on assisting newcomers in Northern Ontario. The project began with a recently concluded pilot in the Thunder Bay area and expanded to the Greater Sudbury region. In the project, the Northern Policy Institute collaborates with the municipality, the local Chamber of Commerce, FedNor, and the Workplace Planning Board. The project came about in response to both the labor force skills gaps, but also service provision gaps. What the project identified was that there were certain groups of potential job seekers who were being underserved by existing programs. The project provides general employability and referral supports for potential immigrants, international students, temporary workers, and secondary migrants, in addition to employer support through workplace diversity initiatives and assistance with skills matching with international talent. So for the pilot, 2 community matchmakers were hired, one that focuses on international talent pools and the other on international students already in the region. An operations coordinator that assists with coordinating with programs and existing services was added, and the Northern Policy Institute provided a research team. Now, the Northwest pilot in Thunder Bay, which was recently concluded, was successful in filling communication gaps between job seekers and employers and it successfully connected job seekers with positions, many of them arriving with their families. We know that when you arrive with their families, there's a greater chance that they will stay. Key to retention was that the project provided assistance with navigating existing services and getting around service and information gaps, because we know getting as much information early on in the process is key to retention. The project also built partnerships with service providers and community actors. Due to the perceived value of the program, many communities and partners have expressed interest in expanding the program to more locations. Now, in the following examples, employers recognized that existing services, particularly existing language classes, were not easy to access for their workforce due to the location and scheduling. So first off, we know that the Canadian meat processing industry relies heavily on recruiting foreign workers to help deal with chronic worker shortages and turnover. Maple Leaf Foods has created recruitment and onboarding supports to welcome newcomers to the company and the community. English proficiency is key to productivity, safety, and worker retention, as is a common language when you have a diverse workforce. So support start doing overseas recruitment, where workers have received up to 160 hours of English language training, in addition to receiving an orientation package about Canadian culture, the community, and settlement information. The supports continue post-arrival with additional ESL support. At the Brandon, Manitoba plant, there are on-site English classes held after hours and on weekends. The classes are free for workers as they're funded by the union and Maple Leaf Foods. You might be more familiar with Highline Mushrooms, what they're doing here. In Southwestern Ontario, they offer English classes. They accommodate newcomer workers to go back to school to upskill. And they have established a family scholarship program for the children of their workers. In Leamington, the classes are offered on the farm and work around the production schedules. As they learn English, workers learn about safety, they learn about HR policies and other work-related information. Now, these supports provided by Highline have influenced the decision to stay with the company long-term, with many of the workers who upskill staying on and taking on leadership or managerial roles. A bit further afield, we have Normantage, a substation manufacturer in a small municipality in Sweden. Normantage is heavily dependent on newcomers for its business to grow. Approximately 50% of its workforce come from refugee backgrounds. So Normantage works with the local settlement provider to find the right people for jobs that involve operating heavy machinery and attention to detail. So they offer Swedish language classes during work hours, and they pair English beginners with native Swedish speakers on shifts. So there's that pair matching, and they can practice their English in a work setting. In addition, the company organizes gatherings and social activities outside of work so that their refugee employees can spend time with the other employees and integrate. Sorry, skipping ahead. So we know that finding adequate, affordable, and suitable housing can be difficult for newcomers in small and rural communities. Availability is often an issue due to the limited variety in the rental housing stock, and some newcomers face discrimination from landlords. The current housing crisis in Canada is not just limited to large urban centers. It is being experienced in rural and small centers across the country. This is happening while regionalization efforts are in place to increase immigration to these communities, and while buyers from larger urban centers are seeking more space and affordability in the fallout of the COVID-19 public health crisis, and they're migrating to smaller and rural communities. So one example is in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where the local settlement provider set up a landlord engagement committee that brings the landlords in the area together every quarter. The small city was experiencing an influx of Somali refugees, and the refugees were finding it difficult to secure apartments despite high vacancy rates, and they were reporting experiences of discrimination from landlords. So the Landlord Engagement Committee, it allowed the landlords to raise issues and concerns in a safe space, while at the same time allowing newcomers to learn how to avoid tenancy issues. And it also made it easier for newcomers to find housing. Now, one thing the pandemic has shown us is that municipalities are capable of reacting quickly with responses to housing shortages, such as converting underutilized hotels, schools, offices, and putting that into affordable housing, and building permanent structures, such as using modular or prefabricated technologies. Increasingly, employers are taking responsibility in securing affordable housing for their employees by providing subsidized housing. Communities can establish partnerships with employers and nonprofit organizations to build affordable housing capacity and improve the access for newcomers. For example, in the Village Council in Chipman, New Brunswick collaborated with J.D. Irving, a logging company, to build an 8-acre subdivision to house foreign workers and their families who were recruited through the Atlantic Immigration Pilot. So the subdivision is made up of mini homes, and it's meant to house the workers and their families until they can find more permanent housing. In Nova Scotia, Riverside Lobster International, they converted an old hotel, they purchased houses, duplexes, and trailers to house workers and their families. In addition, Riverside opened a subsidized daycare center to accommodate workers' families. Now, as I said earlier, newcomer settlement integration involves the entire community, and it's important to build support for newcomers in the community. The New Brunswick Multicultural Council collaborated with economists for the province-wide New Conversations tour to raise awareness about the importance of immigration in solving the province's demographic and labor market challenges. A second tour happened earlier this year, New Conversations 2.0, in recognition that the effort is needed in order to maintain community support for newcomers. Community support for newcomers should not be taken for granted. And we've seen during the pandemic a rise in anti-immigration sentiment in some places, and particularly anti-Asian sentiment. So the support for newcomers needs to be fostered and preserved. It's a constant thing that needs to be worked on. The Immigration Advisory Group in Chatham-Kent, Ontario, is a new resource for the community's local immigration partnership. The group, comprised of immigrants and newcomers residing in Chatham-Kent, provides the LIP with input on how to create a more welcoming community and how to improve the experiences of immigrants in the region. So they're getting that constant feedback. It's part of that monitoring process, and then moving forward, seeing what works, making adjustments and making changes. Now, the Welcome Group program, which you may be familiar with, was created to meet and support the unique needs of government-assisted refugees. It operates out of Thunder Bay, and the partnership is between Costi Immigration Services Toronto and the Thunder Bay Multicultural Association. Now, a welcome group will consist of 5 or more volunteers. And the group typically assists for 6 months, but can continue for a year or more on an informal basis. So through supports from funding through the various organizations, the matches are supported, monitored, and evaluated for 6 months. What really makes this innovative is that it's transferable, in that it can be replicated in any small center that has a strong volunteer base and a settlement or community organization to make the client referrals. Programs that help their families thrive in the community can provide an anchor for newcomer professionals. These include programs that source employment for spouses, resources that make it easier to navigate the education system and access childcare, and family mentoring. So I heard that we have people from the Guelph Wellington region here. So I'm going to be talking about your family mentoring program that matches immigrant families with long-term Canadian families to create a sense of belonging and inclusion. So the match families take part in a range of activities, including touring points of interest, playing sports, and participating in community events. So the last thing I want to talk about is how we can harness the diversity that newcomers bring to the workforce and to our communities. For employers and communities, as more newcomers join your workplace, they will bring with them a diversity of perspectives. They have worked in international contexts, and they will bring cultural, linguistic, and market knowledge with them. In order to harness the benefits of this and increase worker satisfaction, you need businesses to create a culture of inclusion. And that culture of inclusion starts from the top with the leadership. So leaders are responsible for the culture of their organizations, and they need to model the change that they wish to see. So leaders create the conditions under which people feel authorized to bring their knowledge and experience to the table. So are you cultivating that? Do workers feel comfortable suggesting new ideas or discussing their previous experiences? In order to create the conditions under which diversity can have a positive impact on the business and community, leaders should be continually educating themselves and to be deliberate and public about it. It's key that everyone in the organization and the community sees, what the leaders are doing in order to increase inclusion. Often the structures and hierarchies that we see in the broader society are replicated in our workplaces. Diverse teams realize performance benefits when status differences between ethnic groups are minimized. So be willing to reshape power structures and empower individuals. When welcoming new people into organizations or the business, we need to be open to letting them find their own way of achieving the business's objectives and not expect them to conform to the way things have always been done. This is how innovation happens. This means using employees' diverse knowledge and experiences to learn how best to accomplish the business's core work better. So cohesion, productivity, worker satisfaction, and ultimately retention will be enhanced when cultural differences are seen as a resource and not simply tolerated. Ultimately, the goal of these strategies is to make newcomers feel that they're part of the company's long-term business strategy, that they're part of the community's long-term plans, rather than a short-term fix to labor challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalya. That presentation was incredible. And I love to see the strategies that are tactical and they're local and they're ways that employers can really implement something. We had some questions while you were presenting. The first question is, are the English language classes you're sharing, Natalya, provided by federally or provincially funded partners?
Okay, so in the case of Maple Leaf Foods, it's funded by the union at the workers union there, and also by Maple Leaf Foods. So in that case, not federally funded. In the case of Highline, they're funding the workers. In the case of Normantage in Sweden, they are the ones providing the language supports for their workers. So it's employer funded.
Wow, it's an employer initiative. That's great. The second question is, of the supports you gave for newcomer settlement, which do you think is the most important?
Well, I'm kind of biased because I do a lot of research on housing. So, I don't know if it's the most important, but on, top on my list is housing. If you can't find a place to live or house your family, that to me is key. Next, I think would be finding supports to make sure that your family is able to integrate in the community. So for example, if you have children, getting them, situated in the schools and finding childcare. Also getting, if your spouse or partners or family members need employment, and if you're able to find that, that would also improve retention. So I think those housing and employment for family members, as well as navigating the educational system and childcare would be huge.
What about how are the settlement strategies of newcomers similar in smaller cities, different sorry, how are the settlement strategies of newcomers in smaller cities different than the strategies implemented in bigger cities?
So in the smaller cities, we don't, for example, in the north, where I'm from, there's a great geographic distance between the various communities, right? So you have to find a way to provide services over a large distance when you have low population densities. Whereas I think in the larger urban areas, you can take advantage of the fact that people are more, closely situated, and you also have greater access to larger immigrant communities. So when you're in a smaller urban center, I think it benefits you to share more resources with a larger number of other smaller centers. And then you can benefit from economies of scale in that way, since you yourself are not large enough to cover the cost of a lot of these programs. So that's one thing that impacts settlement services. It's the fact that you have low population densities and you're covering a larger geographic region in most cases. Yeah. And there's also the tax base issue. The fact that a lot of small communities, there's a smaller tax base to drive the funding for these services as well.
Yes, yeah. I guess the lower number of resources, right? Okay, so so we have a comment too, a comment and a question. So interesting that employers and municipalities are providing subsidized housing. Just wondering what types of policies are in place. For instance, should the employee lose their job, what happens to their housing? If the employee were to lose their job, what happens to their housing? Without thorough agreements, there could be some different dynamics created for this model. Example, employees may feel obliged to meet employer demands for fear of losing their housing.
That's a really good question, and something that actually I would like to investigate further. How these particular agreements, how disputes are worked out, because we know that outside of the employer providing housing, newcomers have issues with their landlords, right? And language sometimes plays a barrier. So what happens if your landlord is your employer? Yeah, this is something it's a fascinating question. Certainly, I would like to investigate that further to see what is a best practice in terms of the contract or the relationship between the employer, who is your landlord, and the newcomer. Yeah, this is a very good question. I'm sorry, I don't have more insights on how that issue is resolved.
Speaking of that question, I had a question of my own, which was just like when companies offer their housing to their workers, what is the usual process of the newcomer to then transition into like their own acquired housing? Like, so how do you see that transition happen?
Okay, well, of course, the reason this is happening is because there's a shortage of private rental housing in the community. One of the things that happens in some of these instances is that the employer might have an individual dedicated to helping the newcomer as they're in this subsidized housing find something else. So they'll partner with someone in real estate or a community partner, and then they will assist a newcomer to find something that's more suitable for them. For example, if the mini home, you have a large family, say you have a lot of children and you need a larger space, the real estate agent or the community partner will help find more suitable housing during that time period. And then the individual hopefully will transition to the more permanent housing.
That's a fantastic partnership. That's something that I would have never thought of. So, that's amazing. Someone is asking if if everyone will be provided with a copy of the PowerPoints. If you're comfortable with that, Natalya.
Yes, I sent it ahead. So yes, I'm perfectly comfortable sharing that.
Okay, so
and if any, I was just saying, if anyone wants more details on the specific programs, I can provide links.
That would be great. So yes, on that topic, everything will be we'll have an archive on the Growing Your Workforce Conference website. So you'll be able to find Natalya's slides there. And I believe that her contact information was on the side of the screen. So if you have any more questions for her, feel free to email her at the email address that was provided. And thank you so much, Natalya, for your presentation.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your questions.